Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's podcast on the big political issues of the week. I'm senior political reporter Marc Daalder. Joining me from Auckland is Newsroom's co-editor Tim Murphy, and from Christchurch, Newsroom's national affairs editor Sam Sachdeva. You may be listening to this on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday, but we're recording this on a Thursday, the biggest day of the year. It is Halloween. Obviously, being American, I partake. I'm very excited about it. Tim, Sam, what are your views on Halloween? How excited are you for the trick-or-treaters to come knocking tonight?
Thank you for the warning, Mark. You're a godsend. I'll go home tonight, lock the gate, close the door, pull down the blinds, and make my house frown, if it can, at the parting hordes.
Oh, look, hello, Mark. Happy Halloween. I'm probably a little bit more of a fan than Tim. I'm living, sadly, in a very rural part of Canterbury at the moment, so probably not going to get many kids coming down the very long driveway. But in case you haven't guessed, I've dressed up as Christopher Luxon today. That's my costume. We have a very similar hairstyle. So I'm looking forward to chunking down some big rocks through decision gates with you guys.
I'm looking forward to that as well, Sam. And yes, I agree. It is sad to live in a rural part of Canterbury. Today on Raw Politics, the closing days of the last election, maybe in United States history, are upon us. And we're going to discuss David Seymour's seemingly easy wins on education and how to strike a balance on building consents and deregulating that sector. As always, to wrap up, we'll offer you some recommendations. We are in the closing days of the 2024 U.S. presidential election, maybe its last one ever. The polls are tighter than any other election in U.S. history. Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are basically dead even on the national vote, and neither has more than a 1-point margin in recent polls in any of the 7 key swing states. We've had sort of 2 big set pieces over the last couple of days. First, we had yesterday Kamala Harris's sort of closing argument, is what she described it as, her final big speech of the campaign, in which she cast herself as a unifier for a divided country and Trump as a, quote, petty tyrant. And Donald Trump's rally in Madison Square Garden in New York, which made headlines for other reasons, one speaker calling the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico an island of garbage, and Trump's aide, Stephen Miller, saying America is for Americans and Americans only. Before we dive into the election, for those who understandably aren't familiar with the U.S. electoral system and assume that it might be something like New Zealand's, it's very different. A quick backgrounder there. You've got 50 states in America. Each one of them has a set number of electoral votes, which roughly corresponds to population. But those votes are not assigned proportionally based on how candidates do in each state, but for almost every state, it's a winner-take-all situation. So if Kamala Harris wins Pennsylvania 51% to Donald Trump's 49%, she gets all of Pennsylvania's electors. Most states go one way or another pretty reliably, which means that there are just about 7 swing states that people are looking at here that could decide the fate of the election. That's Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin in the sort of Midwest and Great Lakes region. It's Georgia and North Carolina in the Southeast, and Arizona and Nevada in the Southwest. Do either of you have any thoughts on, given how close it is, not hopes for, but thoughts on which way, predictions for maybe, which way this election will go?
Well, I think there are 2 things here. One is the known unknowns, and that goes to what you were talking about, Mark, which is the possibilities occurring in these 7 swing states. And it's so narrow, and depending on turnout and so on, what happens there, we don't know. So that's sort of one aspect. But there are also the unknown knowns that the general public, the voting public, aren't privy to, that the campaigns are. So both Trump and Harris's campaigns will know the state of play right down to county by county likelihoods in those 7 states and what could happen. I was struck by a video that Jen O'Malley-Dillon, who's the chair of Harris's campaign, put out late this week, in which she basically addressed people down the camera looking upbeat, trying to look upbeat. But her opening line was, I just want to talk to you about your anxiety and why you don't have to feel down, you can feel good. Because basically saying, we've got this in broad terms. What she said was, we see multiple paths forward for a Harris victory. And at this time, usually in a campaign, sometimes it narrows down to one path left ahead of you, that you've only got one way to do it, and that's all you can do. She's claiming they're seeing multiple paths there. But this comes down to who's saying it, of course, and from the Trump side of things, they're basically putting out that if the nationwide poll result is as tight as it is, if it's all tied, then there's no way that Harris can pull through and win it. So that you take your information from one end or the other, and even if you take it through independent eyes and analysts from the states who are used to all this, they'll sort of one day take fright at one set of stats and the next day go the other way. So look, it's very hard, it's bewildering from afar. Even if you are political junkies like we all are, and news junkies, and you're taking a lot of it in, it's pretty hard to get a distillation of what's going on. So if they think they know in the Harris campaign that they've got multiple paths, then maybe we'll see that. But as you said, Mark, I think you pointed to a couple of weeks ago, the Nate Cohn piece in the New York Times, that if it's a statistical tie nationwide, then it could break a big result either way. So here we are, less than a week out, totally tied up, but might be a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, would I put any meaningful amount of money on picking a winner? I would not. But at the moment, I think I would probably lean towards Trump. Maybe that's a degree of preparing for the worst, and, hoping for the best. But, there's another Nate Silver, well known for his polling. I had a quick look at his numbers, and in a number of those swing states, the trend seems to be heading in the Republican direction. That doesn't mean they'll all go Republican, but if you look at the polling sentiment, things are moving that way. And the other factor is, if it is not a clear win for Kamala Harris, for the Democratic Party, there are a number of mechanisms that the Republicans might look to. You've got a 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's shown that it is willing to intervene in some cases in favour of the Republicans, or at least the arguments they make. You had Donald Trump talking this week about sort of this lovely deal or lovely discussion, great discussion he's had with the Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker of the House, about, what might happen if things don't shake out. So, I think if you're Kamala Harris, you really want it to be as commanding as possible. But I think Tim's right. Things, if the polling is even off by 1 or 2 points in either direction, all of a sudden a nail-biter can turn into a landslide. But, it's really hard to say.
Sam, you forgot one of the tools by which Donald Trump could be president, which is called a coup. He tried it last time, and he'll do it again, regardless of how the election pans out. Tim, I wanted to pick up on one thing that you were mentioning about the national vote, because in the United States for the past several decades, there's been this trend of, because of the non-proportional nature of the electoral system, Democrats winning the popular vote, but not always then winning the presidency. Since 1992, only once has a Republican presidential candidate actually won the majority of votes in a presidential election. That was Bush in 2004. It looks like now, though, that trend, according to Nate Cohn in the New York Times, may be starting to reverse. So there is a scenario where actually the inverse happens, that Trump wins the popular vote, but that Kamala Harris just squeaks by in enough swing states to win the Electoral College, sort of doing the inverse of exactly how Trump won in 2016. Wondering what you guys think of the effectiveness of sort of the closing arguments that we're hearing in the campaign. Kamala Harris's point, which we discussed around the debate earlier in the year as well, saying, presenting herself as a unifier, as a calm head in the room, and trying to, paint Trump as, well, all of these things that he himself has happily said that he is, right? And to what degree does that work on an electorate that's maybe as divided as the United States electorate?
Well, for me, Mark, I think the closing argument by Trump in these last weeks has been the most effective. And it's an old political, truism, but they're using it, he and his surrogates in all instances, to ask the voting public, do you feel better off now than 4 years ago? He's trying to cast Harris with Biden and say that, people aren't better off. There seems to be a stubborn willingness by voters to actually accept that they're not better off, despite the fact that inflation, I think, is 2.4% in the States. Unemployment's 4%, which is regarded internationally as low. That's about what New Zealand is now. And pay rates and take-home wages and so on are going up. So there are arguments to be made that, people should feel better off, at this point anyway, of the Biden-Harris regime. One of the big things I think that has been amiss for for Harris and for Biden, both in their prosecution back against Trump's line on do you feel better off. They keep talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a major piece of legislation got through by Biden. It wasn't much to do with inflation, Mark, as you'd know. It was about climate measures, and it was about manufacturing and job stimulation. And it's created hundreds of thousands of jobs, many of them in red or Republican zones of America. And I saw a thing the other day from someone in Biden's orbit who just said, our big mistake with this was that all over the country we didn't have signs made, neon sort of boards or even stickers on everything saying, Joe did this, to signify that there was a big economic stimulus, it did have an effect, and things happened. But they've kind of lost a bit of that argument to Trump, and I think he's playing hard on the most basic political strand there. Her closing arguments on his threat to democracy, on his threat to the rights of women, they are more targeted at possible swing voters, and it might be that she's peeling off a few people enough in those, but in a broad sense, the economic argument still seems to be polling as the cut-through one.
Yeah, I mean, I read an interesting piece on Vox unpicking the Harris campaign's slogans or lines in the closing days and questioning whether it makes sense to focus on the sort of authoritarianism line. On the one hand, you'd say, yes, it is very concerning, and the American people should know about this. You've got someone who's talking about ruling with an iron fist, and what some people in his campaign have said, General Kelly, I think, calling him a fascist or saying he, fits the definition of a fascist. But the counter-argument to that was, that is baked in already. People know who he is when it comes to that. So that's not actually going to shift that many swing votes at this point. It's kind of put into the equation. So perhaps they should be focusing more on the sort of economic picture and drawing a contrast there. And I think there is some element to which that's happening. You've got the super PACs, these political action committees, if that's the right acronym, that provide advertising on behalf of a candidate but not coordinated with it. I think there is some economic messaging going out there, but it was kind of interesting to me to hear that skepticism about, is this the right angle to be targeting as Americans are going to the polls?
Yeah, and I'm interested in the economic thing as well, right? Because Donald Trump did figure that out with the COVID stimulus, where he had his signature inked on every single check that went out. I got my stimulus checks, by the way. The third one that I got had Donald Trump's signature on it. It was printed on the 6th of January, 2021, on the day that he had incited an insurrection at the Capitol. So I cashed it, but I cashed it digitally, so I kept a copy of it because I think it's a good souvenir. Sam, with your foreign affairs hat on and your trade hat on, we've heard some arguments from various New Zealanders about what the US election might mean for New Zealand. John Key saying, he thought maybe Donald Trump would be, at least for Americans, the best from an economic perspective, but also maybe implying that there might be some benefits for New Zealand there. Others have said, well, the tariffs are problematic for us, obviously. What's the effect of the US election on New Zealand from a trade angle and anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think trade looms large, right? And there's a lot of concern here about what Trump might do in terms of tariffs. He's talked about having a 10% tariff across the board on imports, and that would be hugely damaging for New Zealand exporters trying to send products in there. And, I've talked to the Trade Minister, Todd McClay, about this, and he said, oh, no, look, we try very hard to secure an exemption. We'd say friends don't do this to other friends. But the steel tariffs that Trump put in place in his first term, those are still in place on New Zealand steel exports or imports into the US. So I'm not sure that would really bear any fruit. That's the big concern. I think there's just unpredictability, and we saw this the first time around where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the government was caught on the hop by a lot of decisions. The sort of quote-unquote Muslim ban that the Trump administration put in place. We saw New Zealand trying to scramble to make sense of that. There were difficulties in even finding someone who had a number for the president. There's been a lot of work that's gone into that. I think I mentioned a few episodes back Thomas Manch's story looking at the sort of scenario planning that MFAT has been doing on sort of Team Red or Team Blue, what that means. But there's only so much preparation you can really do given the chaos that seems to, encircle Trump and in and out of office. So that's the big issue. The other interesting point is, things like AUKUS. We're still having these sort of exploratory talks. And that becomes even more of a tough sell if you have Donald Trump in the Oval Office and the White House. So, Christopher Luxon's rhetoric around working more closely with like-minded partners. How does that survive? How would that survive a second term of Trump, given what we know about how the majority of New Zealanders feel about him?
Back in New Zealand, we've seen two announcements in the past couple of weeks from Associate Education Minister David Seymour, who does seem to be making more headlines in this role than in most of his other ministerial ones, at least. First, we had the new school lunches program, unveiled and announced. The 240-gram meals for year 8s and under, 300 grams for those older, each at just $3 a meal. Some gallery reporters got to try them out, not me, but our Fox Meyer reported back, said tasted pretty good. And then second, Seymour capitalised this week on a new report from the Education Review Office into truancy. The ERO says the situation is a crisis, and Seymour used this to highlight the government's school attendance policies. We haven't seen a whole lot of impact and movement in the data from those policies, but they only went into effect earlier this year. It's the sort of thing that I think everyone expects will take some time. Tim, education, a big issue for voters, one of those bread and butter issues, to pull a phrase from last year. Are these easy wins on school lunches and maybe on truancy? Are these easy wins for the government and for ACT in particular?
I think nothing's easy in education. It's a gradient of difficult to very difficult, really. But at the hardest end are the things that Erica Stanford, as Minister of Education, is trying to sort on the curriculum, on achievement levels and pass rates for everything from the PISA test down to, testing of 12-year-olds on reading and maths and so on. So that's pretty gnarly, difficult to shift stuff. If you were to say something is easier in the hard realm of education, looking at school lunches and the cost and delivery of them, and looking at truancy and how to get kids more often back to school would be those. They're retail politics, and as we know, David Seymour's a pretty fine retail politician in his way. So he's taken them on board, and he's given them a good shake, and he's stamped them very firmly with ACT's stamp and brand, even though I think National had been going on about truancy for a long time through before they came into government as well. I think with the food, let's see. They're talking a big game and how much they're saving, and how much was that figure? 100 and something?
120 million, something like that.
$120 million to the taxpayer. So a lot of people are going to say, well, that's good. If we can cut it down but still give most of the kids who need it some food. But truth is that, you're not going to get the kind of food for a cheaper mass-produced amount than you are if you spend a bit more. And while we can all see savings, we know, I think, any of us who have been or had family members in hospital, when the mass-produced food comes along and it's a bit delayed and it's a slightly longer period than testing it at live PR events, it verges on the inedible and the slop, and people don't get it as a sort of a appetizing, nutritious, appealing meal. So, kids are kids, and kids will turn up their noses faster than sick patients, probably. I think there's a scope here for this to start to unravel a bit because of, the lack of appeal, the lack of nutrition next year or the one after. On the other aspect, on truancy, this is one that, as I say, ACT's grabbed. This was an ERO report this week which found that, yes, the attendance levels in New Zealand are a concern. and the ones who are really not attending is a real concern. And fair enough, it's something that needs to be grabbed and dealt with. ACT's, making a big song and dance over this, and he is too. He's talking, I think I heard him on the radio talking about, the police going along with officers to sort of totally recalcitrant kids and parents, and making that point. That would be an unusual nanny state, innovation for a libertarian party. However, it's one, again, that you say to people, we're going to get on top of this. This has been left by the previous government without attention. I'm pretty sure it wasn't, but not for sufficient attention, and we're going to do it. So I think that one's got more chance of him getting a sort of a political gain. The other one with the meals is a bit risky, and who knows what kids can judge.
And I should say, Fox did report back, there were a number of extra meals left over after the tasting session. They weren't boxed up to be sent to schools, so that was maybe a good thing. But they were given to the, whoever wanted some could take them away. And Fox took a chickpea curry, which sounds pretty woke to me, by the way, back with him. And as he was leaving, the chef did say, make sure you eat that within an hour, in a sort of joking way. But it didn't sound like there was maybe a joke fully underlying that. So exactly what that means or what's going on with the situation there, I guess we'll find out. Sam, besides this kind of obvious question that Tim has laid out about the real quality and nutritiousness and of the school lunches, what are some of the risks here with both the school lunch policy but also the truancy one?
Yeah, starting with school lunches, Tim's probably hit the nail on the head. It's really going to be uptake, how many of these lunches do get eaten, how many get unused. Because if you start having the sort of usage rate, for lack of a better word, or take-up drop precipitously, and you end up in a position where the government decides it's going to cancel it, that could lead itself to, accusations that this has been a deliberate thing, that they've, sort of degraded the quality of the meals as an excuse to get rid of it. Now, we're some way away from that, but that's something that David Seymour and the government is going to have to keep a close eye on. What does this actually do to the numbers of children who are eating these meals? There's a community element as well. I've seen some discussions from school communities who say, look, this was a sort of a bonding exercise for us. It brought communities together. We were working with local suppliers. In some cases, I think kids come in and see how the meals are prepared and learn about cooking and food in that way, and that's sort of gone now. Yes, technically schools can still prepare their own meals, but I think they've been given $4 a meal as opposed to the $3 a meal that the consortium are providing them for, and that extra dollar is supposedly meant to cover all of the labour for schools. So either they're going to have to dip into their own budgets, probably quite considerably, to fund this, or they're just going to have to go with the sort of big box rate. So that's a concern. Truancy, I think it's pretty clear that action needs to be taken. I don't think there's any meaningful bipartisan any cross-party opposition or confusion over this. The bigger issue is going to be, when you pull at this thread, what does it unravel? Can you just treat truancy in a vacuum by itself, or do you have to deal with some of those underlying causes? I think it might have been the president of the PPTA who was talking about poverty, mental health, and some of those drivers that affect attendance rates and whether or not children are showing up. And there's only so much you can do if you send cops around to people's doors, right? You've kind of got to deal with the underlying issues there. And I'm sure the government will say it's, ready for that challenge, but that's, again, going to be a longer term thing. It'll take a while to reap rewards, and that's going to require investment as well, which the coalition doesn't necessarily have the money to do.
Social investment, on the other hand, there's room for, and maybe this is a problem that social investment is designed to solve. The other thing that Laura Walters has reminded us frequently is when you set some of these targets for school attendance and require all this public reporting, you quite quickly end up in a situation where schools are sort of gaming the system, fudging the data, ringing someone who hasn't been to school for several weeks and they know aren't coming to school for a variety of reasons, and just saying, oh, hey, so-and-so's sick, right? And then writing down, oh, it's an excused absence, so the data looks better, when in reality, this is just a kid who's dropped off the map. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that the supplier sort of for the school lunches, Compass, I think is the company's name, there's been some reporting noting that they've had previous complaints about them, that there was a protest, I think, in Canterbury around their supplying to the hospital there. Maybe it might have been Dunedin.
Possibly Dunedin Hospital.
The South Island, it's all kind of the same to me. Again, that exact same situation. There was a principal in Taranaki who said, yes, we actually had them in to supply food to our schools. We tasted all the food when it was, first offered to us, and it was fantastic. But by the time it actually started getting into the school en masse, the quality fell significantly. Issues with, moldy food and stuff. Not just it wasn't quite tasty, but, it shouldn't have been eaten or was inedible. So the government says they're aware of this. Ministry says it's working on the sort of performance with the company. So we'll see how much they can kind of whip that into shape or whether it risks, a repeat of those local situations, but on a national scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think David Seymour made the argument that, maybe an unfortunate case or two shouldn't taint the wider work, but this is going to be the problem, right? When you're working at the scale that Compass and these providers are, there are going to be, a reasonable number of cases where there is food that's clearly not fit for consumption or has problems with it, and the government is going to have to deal with that, and that's that will be very irritating to parents or teachers if they see that happening in their school, and they're going to be quite understandably upset. So there's going to need to be a plan in terms of really clamping down on any problems, and as you say, having the ministry manage any performance issues before it sort of snowballs.
And we've already had the problem where Compass has been delivering woke food, which is clearly against the rules. So one first strike. We'll see if there are two more. Our reader question for this week is the risk of deregulating the building sector worth the potential gain? The government is looking into allowing the building industry to self-certify themselves instead of needing council inspections for building consents in some circumstances. And we also had a report this week on Newsroom, a scoop from Andrew Bevan, that the government has now authorised its first private company to issue building consents alongside councils. There's cautious support for this sort of self-certification idea from Labour, but there are concerns around, a potential repeat of the leaky homes crisis. Tim, what do you think of this question? We do have this housing supply issue. Are the risks here worth the benefits?
They might be. Chris Penk, the minister, has been pretty studious, and he's been pretty active in this particular space. I think this is the third or fourth announcement on building consents and building standards over the last month or so by him. They look to me, in the conditions they've put on this change, to have anticipated where concerns might arise. So they're for simple, single-level buildings. They're not for complex, which I presume involves, apartments or multis or, terraced housing, that sort of thing. So it's more for the standard type of home. There is risk though, and go back 20 years, a national administration about the time of, in parallel with the leaky buildings crisis, the tens of billions of dollars of private and public money that was lost from building materials and building standards that were changed then, but also at the same time building inspection was changed. It wasn't given to builders themselves to self-certify, it was given to private firms, as you mentioned, Mark, is happening again now. And the private firms variously went bust or went out of existence or were, in the end, regulated back into local government consenting authorities for a reason. There were concerns that things were missed and it was hurried and it was sort of done on the basis of the dollar rather than the quality of care and safety and standard of the house. So look, I think they have taken on board some of those issues with this, and they've cited figures though that may not be as grievous as we think in terms of the delays that councils are taking in consenting, both for building consents and compliance certificates for homes. I went on and had a look at the new figures on the MB
Business innovation and employment.
I went on and had a look at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment site, which Chris Penk has also had them do, where they now collate details of how fast councils are doing consents. And they're pretty fast. Most of them, in the 95, 94%, are doing both building consents, I think, within 9 days on average, and code compliance certificates are as low as 4 days for the sort of the average of that. So, they've inflated the problem a little bit here, saying it's taken forever and 500 days to build a house. A lot of that's in the building and the subbies and the supply chain things as much as the council's end of it. But if this frees it up a bit, yes, could be good.
I did notice that figure. I think it's 560-something days that Chris Penk is talking about to get a house built and consented. And I did think those are two different things maybe, and there's some obfuscation going on here. So it's helpful to have that the council level consenting data. If it really is a couple weeks we're talking about there, I think maybe that's a case of a chart crime or some misleading data being used. Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something that you've watched, read, or listened to this week that you enjoyed. I'll start with you, Sam.
Yeah, I would like to recommend a new podcast from our very own Jonathan Milne called Powder Keg, and that is looking into AG1, a sort of supplement company, and it's New Zealand founder Chris Ashenden. There's on the surface it seems like a Kiwi kid made good, and he's built up this $1 billion company. But John has done a lot of digging. It's taken him months, if not years, and has found some questionable areas, both to do with his past in New Zealand and some issues with AG1 itself. I listened to the first 2 episodes today. I'm already gripped, and I'm looking forward to getting through the rest of it.
Tim?
Mine's a piece from the progressive US publication The Nation, which is a guy, Eli Mistel, I think, who has looked into the sort of offhand comment Trump made at his Madison Square Gardens rally, in which he said that he has a secret plan for after the election with the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. And this piece looks into what that might be, and it might not just be taking the Electoral College decision-making to the House itself, state by state. He's saying there's another plan, which he thinks is worse, that would be hatched to get Trump elected. So well worth a read.
And that feeds into my recommendation for this week on the topic of, maybe we had a big discussion about the election, but it might not matter anyways. My recommendation is the film this year, Civil War, which is a really good journalism film, but also maybe a preview of what's to come in America.
That's what I love about you, Mark, your glass half full, relentlessly positive attitude.
Being first a COVID reporter, then a climate reporter, it just makes you see all the good that there is in the world. That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer, Dave Filoi-Ali'i, and our readers, listeners, and viewers. Have you got any burning questions that you would like to share with us or want us to have a go at answering? You can email us at laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. And you can find us next week here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.